All right, well, this is Ellen Brown, one of the head recruiting coaches here at NCSA. I'm with Dan Blank, who has a wealth of experience in the collegiate coaching world. Just to tell you a little bit about his background first, he was most recently the associate head coach at University of Georgia for the women's side. He has also been the former assistant at the University of Mississippi. He was the head coach at Embry-Riddle, where he actually started from scratch. Also the former head coach at Bruton-Parker, so he's got a good bit of experience at different levels as well. He's also coached some semi-pro, the head coach at Jacksonville Jade and assistant general manager for Atlanta Classics. In addition to his coaching experience, he's also an author and has several books out on the market which are incredibly popular, such as Soccer IQ, Things That Smart Players Do, Rookie, Surviving Your Freshman Year of College Soccer, Everything Your Coach Never Told You Because You're a Girl, which is a favorite of mine, and the new Possession, Teaching Your Team to Keep the Darn Ball. All of those books, by the way, are available on Amazon.com for less than $10. Just a little plug here because they're really good books. I've read several of them myself, and currently occupy, 8 of the top 20 selling spots for soccer coaching books, I believe, ahead, by the way, of books by Anton Dorrance and Sir Alex Ferguson. So let's get started. All right, Dan, what do you look for in a Division I college recruit?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's obviously soccer players are going to be evaluated in 4 main areas: technical, tactical, psychological, and physical. And we're looking for the highest and best combination of those 4 areas. Now, if a player can distinguish yourself with an exceptional amount or an exceptional score, so to speak, in one of those areas, obviously coaches might be more forgiving if she kind of has a deficiency in another area. For example, if a player has blinding speed, a coach might be able to overlook some of her technical weaknesses, but by and large, we're looking for the highest combination in those 4 areas. There's also, some certain position-specific considerations that we have to, weigh in with. If you're a forward, the ability to finish is obviously important. We're looking for wingers who can turn the corner and get off quality crosses. If you're a center midfielder, you have to have the ability to break pressure and to distribute balls, in the final third, so to speak. So there's position-specific considerations that also come into play. And then there's also the things that we can't see, and we depend on other people for inside information, and that's why we're going to talk to club coaches and high school coaches, because we want to know about your training habits. That's something we don't get to see when we watch you compete at a tournament. We want to know about your off-the-field lifestyle. Obviously, we're not looking for players who want to spend their free time partying all the time, and we want to know about your effect on team chemistry, because, we're going to have to adopt you for 4 years. And, it doesn't matter how talented you are. If you're cancer to your team's chemistry, then that's not something that we're going to obviously pursue. For me personally, I'm looking for players who, have some of the things that we can't teach. I want players who are fast, super aggressive, and courageous. And I think if you have those things that coaches really can't do much to improve upon, I think you're off to a real good start.
Great information. Thanks. How important is the level of club soccer that a recruit plays?
Well, I think the level of play is, more important for exposure than anything else, simply because when we go trolling, we're going to troll in the ponds with the biggest fish. So the ECNL events are going to attract, the most coaches in the biggest schools. Now, that said, we've recruited some great players from smaller, lesser-known clubs. But most of the time that's because someone put us onto that player, or that player sent us a really impressive video. So, you can be a great player in a lower profile club, but it's going to be harder for you to get the exposure that you might be looking for.
And how would a recruit know if they were a top recruit for you? I mean, what signs do you see?
Well, I think if a player is a top recruit, genuinely a top recruit, she's going to know it. She's going to know it for one thing, because we're going to tell her. And we're going to tell her club coach, we're going to tell her parents, we're going to tell her high school coach, we're going to tell whoever we can, because we want that player to know how serious we are about bringing her into our program. I think this is one of the most important things about the recruiting process that no one really talks about, and that's knowing whether or not the college is recruiting you or you're recruiting the college. And I think that has a big determination, or should have a big determination on where somebody chooses to go to school. Now, obviously, you want to go to college and play college soccer. You don't want to go to college and watch college soccer. So knowing where you stand in kind of the recruiting totem pole is going to help you determine realistically your chances of playing. The more a school is recruiting you, then the more likely you are to actually play at that university. If you're somebody who's not getting a lot of phone calls or emails from a particular college, then obviously you're not a priority. And I think a lot of kids misinterpret some of these things. You know, if a coach returns your email, it doesn't automatically mean that you're a top prospect for that particular school. It doesn't even mean you're a prospect at all. Sometimes it's a coach, you know, is just being polite. And I think you've got to be honest when you're going through this process. Am I recruiting them or are they recruiting me? You know, you're free to play at a school that's recruiting you than at a school that you are doing the recruiting.
And how important is it in the process for a recruit to actually call a coach on the phone?
I think it's very important because with this excessively early recruiting that has taken hold of women's college soccer, the rules dictate that coaches can't call the players until most of the time until after the player is already committed. So we can't even return a missed call. We can't return a dropped call. So we're very dependent on the players calling us, and not just calling us, but continuing to call until they actually reach us. And I think that's a really important thing for players to understand, not to give up calling. If we're not answering, it's not because we're trying to avoid you. It's just that we missed the call. Yeah, I went through a 2-week patch when it seemed like every time I stepped into the shower, I missed a call from one of our top recruits, and it was driving me nuts. It's very frustrating because we know these kids can misinterpret that for avoidance, but believe me, we'd much rather actually answer the phone. So my advice is that when you're trying to call a coach, plan on calling every 20 or 30 minutes until you reach him. Or in lieu of that, leave a voicemail that says, I'll call you tomorrow at 8 p.m. or send an email that says, I'll call you tomorrow at 8 p.m. Leave a specific time so that the coach knows to have his phone on him and his ringer on. But when you do that, actually, make sure you follow through and make the call.
Good advice, yeah. How important is it for a recruit to attend an ID clinic or camp?
Camps and ID camps are fantastic opportunities for players. Now, from the coaching side, you've got to keep in mind that camps and ID camps are money machines, so to speak. And so just going to an ID camp doesn't necessarily mean that, you're going to be recruited. But and the vast majority of players that attend an ID camp aren't going to be recruited. The benefit of going to an ID camp at a specific school, for one, it shows that you have an interest in that university. And the second thing, it puts you in front of the coach for, a day or two in a kind of a smaller numbers environment. ID camps can be very useful in getting you on a coach's radar. And the same goes for summer camps, because the summer camp, now you've got, 4 or 5 days in front of the coach. But I'll give you a real good piece of advice. If you're attending a camp at a university that you are very serious about attending, make sure that coach knows that's why you're going to that camp. Send an email saying, look, I'm coming to this camp, and I would really appreciate it if you would take a look at me while I'm here. Because what a lot of coaches will do is they're going to group those players that have either called or written to say that's why they're coming to camp, and they're going to put them in one group. And, typically in a camp setting, the groups are going to play an 11-a-side game in the evenings. And the coach of that college is going to make sure that he's watching that specific group on most of the nights during that camp. So let him know that's why you're coming. You're more likely to get a look from that coach.
We kind of touched on this earlier when you were talking about whether a school is recruiting you or whether you're recruiting the program. What questions should a recruit ask to kind of figure that out, like where they stand in a coach's recruit list?
First and foremost, it would be really helpful to get your club coach involved in this process, because club coach can college coach and say, hey, look, Jennifer is really interested in your program. Where do you think she'll fit in? Will she fit in at all? And the coach is going to be probably a little more direct and honest with the club coach. And he may say, look, oh, she's a big priority for us. We love her. We're crazy about her. We've got scholarship money for her. And on the other hand, the coach might say, look, she's good enough to be on our roster. She won't start. I don't think she'll actually ever get on the field for us. And it might be kind of painful to hear, but you're better off knowing than not knowing. So I would definitely lean on your club coach a good bit, or even your high school coach, to help figure that out. If you want to go it on your own, I think you just simply have to ask the coach something like, how do you see me fitting into your program? Do you see me as someone who can come in right away and start? Do you see me as someone who might not start but will get some playing time? Or, do you think I'll need a year to develop before I can be a genuine contributor? Keep in mind, and this is why I think going through your club coach is really a smart move, but, coaches don't want to make promises because there are so many unknowns between the time you're being recruited and the day preseason starts. If you're a blue chip recruit, the coach might say, I expect you to start right away. That's not going to be the case for 90% of the players who are going through the recruiting process. A coach doesn't want to get pinned to a promise he knows that he might not be able to keep. So the stock answer for coaches is going to be something like, I expect that you'll come in and compete for playing time, or I think you have the potential to break into the starting lineup. So make sure you listen closely to the words the coach is using and hear what you want to hear. Listen to what he's actually saying. And it behooves you to do your own homework before even having this discussion. Look at the roster and see how many players play your position and how many of those will still be around when you get to college. Pay attention to the recruiting spreadsheets and see what other players have committed to that college or are committing to that college. You want to have this information. For example, if you're a goalkeeper and there are already 4 goalkeepers on the roster and the starter is an all-conference player as a freshman, well, then, you have your work cut out for you. But I would try to arm myself with as much knowledge as possible before I even made that call.
Switching gears just a little bit, let's talk a little bit more about kind of the demands of playing Division I women's soccer. Can you speak towards that a little, the physical, mental aspects, that type of thing?
The demands of Division I soccer are so misunderstood, and that's actually why I wrote the book, Rookie, Surviving Your Freshman Year of College Soccer. When you go on a recruiting visit, it's like you're looking at the honeymoon. And believe me, after 2 days of preseason, the honeymoon's over. College soccer's a job. A big chunk of your waking hours are committed to soccer, and it's not just the 2 games a week, and it's not just the hour and a half of training you have, 4 days a week. You also have to factor in things like strength training. You'll be in the weight room 3 times a week. You have to factor in study hall and tutors 3 or 4 nights a week. You have to factor in treatment for injuries and knocks. And believe me, you're going to need treatment, and that's going to take away another 30 minutes a day. And then you have to factor in travel, all the hours you'll spend in buses and on airplanes. Believe me, travel's a grind. So to excel at Division I soccer, you've got to love what you do. It's when you're playing on ESPN. You've got to love the training grind and the weight room grind and the study hall grind and the travel. You've got to embrace all of that because it's all part of getting to be on the field when that game is on ESPN. The players who find a way to embrace that journey have the best chance of having a successful and rewarding college soccer experience.
Now, you have a lot of players who are playing at top clubs and they're playing year-round. How much of an adjustment physically is freshman year compared to the schedule they're on now?
It's a significant jump physically. As you grow up as a youth soccer player, 1 year you're playing U9, and the next year you're playing U10, and the next year you're playing U11. When you move from club to college, you're basically moving from a U18 league to a U23 league of all-stars. So the speed of play is much faster. The games are much more physical, and you're playing against players who have already adapted to the demands of the college game, players who have gotten bigger and stronger because of the strength program that they're in. So the physicality is a massive jump. You can help yourself a lot, I think, by getting into a strength program, hiring a personal trainer, joining a gym. But do what you can to prepare your body for a much more physically demanding game.
Outside of the physical aspect, what typically are the biggest adjustments for a freshman? I think you kind of touched on this.
Yeah, well, like you said, on the field, it's going to be the speed of play and the physicality. Off the field, it's being mature enough to exist in a world where you have a remarkable amount of newfound independence without self-destructing, and that's where too many freshmen, just
there's always one, right?
Yeah, it's at least, if you're going to college, if that's a priority for you, you're going to struggle, particularly as a freshman. And now, don't get me wrong, you can be a great college soccer player and a great partier, but you've got to have your priorities in order, and you can't let your social life bleed over into your soccer. Otherwise, it's going to be a long, arduous struggle.
And you kind of touched on this question too, but if you can elaborate on it a little bit more, should a freshman expect to sit on the bench?
I think that a freshman should expect that sitting the bench is a very real possibility. You've been the best player on your team for years and years, but when you get to college, guess what? All your teammates were the best players on their teams too. At Georgia, the administration demanded that we carry at least 30 players. That's like 3 full teams. So if everyone was healthy and we had an inter-squad scrimmage, we'd have 10 players as subs. And that's for an inter-squad scrimmage. When we traveled to an away match, we were leaving 12 players at home. And all of those players were, the best players on their teams. So, yeah, particularly if you're going to go to a BCS program, the possibility of sitting the bench is very real. Now, what matters is how you respond to that. Too many players check out if they don't step on the field by the second game. They just give up and start going through the motions. Their training habits dip. They tune out at team meetings and video sessions. If your response is to check out, then you're doomed, well, at least until you check back in. You're not doing yourself any favors by mailing in your effort. And here's the crazy thing about coaches. They're like teachers, but they're constantly trying to feed you the answers that are going to be on the exam. You've got to realize that, and you've got to be smart enough to take advantage of it. Your coach is going to tell you specifically and in great detail exactly what he's looking for. You have to be smart enough to make the proper adjustments to give him what he wants. You have to be dedicated and patient, and you absolutely have to keep the faith that if you continually do the right things day in and day out, that eventually you're going to reap the rewards. You don't know when that day will come because that's ultimately out of your control. So you just have to keep the faith, keep doing your very best day in and day out, and keep taking the answers that he gives you. I cannot stress that enough.
So what are the most common mental weaknesses or deficits that you see on the women's side? And not just, the freshmen coming in, but anyone.
Well, I hope this doesn't get me into too much trouble, but I think the most common weaknesses are courage and the ability to cope without instant gratification. Don't get me wrong, there are a ton of players who train and play with more courage than most men, but there are still too many female players who find ways to duck a challenge for a header, or who back out of a tackle, or who don't slide to keep a ball from rolling out of bounds. If you're a competitive monster, if your signature is blowing up opponents in tackles, some coach is going to love you. There are very few genuine enforcers in women's soccer, so if you happen to be one of them, you're a valuable commodity. The other weakness is this need for instant gratification. Too many players just implode when things don't immediately go in their favor. You might not get on the field for that 1 game or 2 games or whatever, so what? Deal with it. It's not a tragedy. It's not a tragedy if the restaurant doesn't have hummus or the Wi-Fi connection is slow at your hotel. These days there are so many people ingrained with this ridiculous sense of entitlement. As soon as things don't go their way, they're going to implode, they're going to blame the coach, and they're going to go run into mommy and daddy. Have a little pride in yourself. When you get to college, you're an adult. Act like one. Don't act like the world owes you something. Stand up and solve your problems with a degree of dignity. If you can do that, your chances are much, much better.
On the other side of that, what are the most common mental strengths you see in top players?
The top players I've coached are all very courageous in some form or fashion. It could be brute courage, which is just the willingness to throw their bodies around with reckless abandon. But there are other types of courage as well, the courage to train your ass off even when your body aches and you're not feeling particularly peppy. the courage to push yourself into fitness even when you're on your own and no one's watching you, the courage to want the ball when your team is outmatched in talent. There's all these different types of courage, but I think that all the top players have at least one of them.
What are just some general things that players can do to prepare for college soccer? Maybe some common deficits that you see in the youth game.
When you're preparing to arrive for college soccer, I think the first thing is get fit. Fitter than you've ever been. Preseason is a freaking grind, and if you don't show up in the best shape of your life, you're going to struggle. But the problem is not a lot of players know what the best shape of their life is or how to get there. So my advice is, if at all possible, get someone who's gone through college soccer to monitor your fitness activities. You need someone who will hold you accountable and someone who can push you to run through some pain barriers, because when you get to preseason, you're going to run through those barriers. It's amazing how many players I've coached who, when they showed up for their freshman preseason, they talked about how fit they were, and then 3 days later they realized how fit they weren't compared to our expectations. The next thing is study the game. Watch soccer on television. Get to some college games whenever you can. A lot of colleges broadcast their games online now. Watch those games. Watch the games with a critical eye. Don't just be a fan. Take some mental notes and try to learn from the games that you're watching, because that's the level that you're eventually going to be playing at. Finally, and I didn't come here to plug my books, but do yourself a favor. Read Soccer IQ. Read Rookie, and there's so much good information in those books that'll help you out. And each book costs less than $10. Read them both. Invest $20 in preparing for your college soccer experience. I promise that you won't be sorry.
And I can second that. Lastly, what are a few simple things that players can do to elevate their game? Maybe you can give us a little bit of a preview from Soccer IQ or Soccer IQ 2.
I think the first thing I would recommend is to focus on your technical speed. Whatever you can do, learn to do it faster and under more pressure. Train at an uncomfortable level. Make sure you're training at such a level that you're making mistakes. If you're not training at an uncomfortable level, you're not getting any better. If you're not making any mistakes, you're not getting any better. Force yourself out of your comfort zone to improve your technical speed, because, like I said earlier, the speed of play is a big jump from club or high school to college, and your ability to adapt to that speed of play is going to have a lot to do with your technical speed on the ball. And secondly, and again, I'm going to default to Soccer IQ, learn the simple tactical things that most players get wrong. Soccer IQ is a book about the most common mistakes that players make and how to correct those mistakes. There's a reason so many college coaches buy that book for their teams. Do yourself a favor and read it. I promise you'll learn something that will make you a better player, and that's going to improve your chance on the field.
And I can attest to that too. I bought Soccer IQ for one of my college teams, and we read through it, and it's just common sense stuff that as a coach you're reading this and saying, yes, yep, exactly, and it's a really easy read too. Again, we didn't do this podcast just so that Dan could plug the book, but I'll plug it. It's definitely worth a read, and it'll make you a better soccer player. Yeah, anything else, Dan, that you think our recruits could take away from this? You've given us a lot of really valuable information. Thank you.
I worry that maybe I was a little too, it may have come off maybe pessimistic at times, specifically calling college soccer a job. And believe me, once you're there, you'll understand why I said that. But at the same time, I'd like to say that it's the best job that you're ever going to have. So embrace that, love it, give your entire self into it, and you're going to love the experience, and it's going to be one of the best memories, one of the best experiences you're ever going to have in your lifetime. And 40 years later, you're still going to look back at those days when you were a college soccer player and part of a team, and you're going to look back on those days with a great deal of fondness. So, embrace the experience, give yourself to it. You'll never regret doing your best.